Have you ever stopped to wonder how you know anything at all?
Hmm.
I mean, not just what facts you've learned or skills you have, but the actual, structure of knowledge itself. How is it even possible for your mind to grab onto the world?
It sounds almost childishly simple, but it's one of the deepest questions there is, really.
Right. It's like we just do it every day. We see things, we understand relationships, we make judgments.
Without ever really thinking about the machinery behind it all. What has to be true about our own minds for any of that to even happen? What are the necessary conditions?
And that fundamental question, that dive into the conditions of possibility for knowledge and experience, that's exactly where we're headed today.
Uh,
We are tackling, and let's be honest, it's a big one of the most influential, notoriously challenging works in all of Western philosophy.
yeah,
Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason.
it's a beast, but incredibly important.
Absolutely. So our mission here, using the sources we've gathered, is to really unpack Kant's revolutionary arguments. We want to guide you through his whole project, figuring out the scope, and crucially, the limits of what human reason can do.
Especially when it comes to those huge metaphysical questions, right?
We got
Freedom, immortality, the nature of reality itself.
Exactly. Think of this as a kind of deep dive into the very architecture of how we understand anything.
A journey into the foundations of experience. It's complex, no doubt, but the payoff in understanding is huge.
All right, let's dive in. To really get what Kant was doing in the critique, we need to set the scene a bit. Philosophically speaking, what was his main goal with this massive work?
Well, at its core, Kant felt this urgent need to establish really rigorously what human reason can legitimately know, and just as importantly, what it cannot know. He was particularly focused on what he called a priori knowledge. That's knowledge we have independently of any particular experience, not facts you look up or things you learn through observation, but truths that reason can grasp just by itself. Necessary, universal truths.
And he was asking if we could get that kind of a priori knowledge about those big metaphysical questions you mentioned, the soul, the cosmos, God, questions that seem to go beyond what we can just see and touch.
Precisely, because philosophers have been arguing about those things for centuries, And Kant looked around and basically saw a mess. Metaphysics seemed stalled, just this battlefield of endless debates.
Between who, mainly?
Well, broadly, you had the rationalists, like Descartes and Leibniz. They thought reason alone, through logic and maybe some innate ideas, could figure out the fundamental nature of reality.
Okay, pure reason reveals all.
Sort of, yeah. And then you had the empiricists, like Locke and David Hume. They argued, no, hold on, all knowledge ultimately comes from sense experience. You have to see it, touch it, hear it first.
Right. And this brings us to Hume, who seems to have been a major trigger for Kant. The sources say Kant was awakened from his dogmatic slumber by Hume. What did Hume do that was so disruptive?
Hume. Yeah, his skepticism struck right at the heart of something both camps kind of took for granted. Our ability to make necessary judgments about the world using reason.
Like what?
The classic example, and the sources mention this connection to Kant's later discussion in the Transcendental Dialectic, is causality. Hume looked at cause and effect. You strike a match, a flame appears. We say the strike caused the flame.
Sure, seems obvious.
But Hume pointed out we never actually see the causing itself.
Yeah.
We don't perceive some necessary connection or force flowing between the striking and the flame.
We just see one thing happen, then the other thing happens over and over again.
Exactly. We see what he called constant conjunction. Because A is always followed by B, our minds develop a habit, an expectation. When we see A, we expect B. But Hume argued that's just psychology, it's custom. It's not a logically necessary truth about reality that reason can prove.
So belief in cause and effect is just a useful habit, not a rational certainty.
That was Hume's devastating conclusion. And if reason couldn't even guarantee something as basic as causality, how could it possibly prove these huge metaphysical things like God's existence or the immortality of the soul? Hume's work pointed towards a pretty radical skepticism about reason's power.
Okay, so Kant sees this skeptical threat from Hume, and he takes it very seriously. But he doesn't just throw up his hands and agree.
No, he refuses to accept skepticism as the final answer. He deeply respected Hume's critique, saw the problems with the old dogmatic rationalism, but he also wasn't satisfied with empiricism if it just led to dissolving certainty altogether.
He wanted to find a way to save necessary knowledge somehow.
Exactly. That was the challenge. How can we have knowledge that adds something new, what Kant called synthetic judgments, but is also necessary and universal, known a priori, independent of experience? Hume seemed to show that was impossible for things like causality. Kant needed to show how synthetic a priori judgments are possible.
He needed a third way, basically, something beyond pure rationalism and pure empiricism.
Precisely, a path that could acknowledge the role of experience, which the empiricists stressed, but also preserve the possibility of necessary truths, which the rationalists valued. And this quest led him to his famous Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Right. The analogy to Copernicus changing astronomy from Earth-centered to sun-centered.
Right.
How does that apply to philosophy?
It's a brilliant analogy for the shift in perspective he proposed. Think about it. The traditional view, held by both rationalists and empiricists in different ways, was that knowledge happens when our minds somehow conform to objects out there in the world. The object is the given, and our mind has to grasp it or mirror it.
The mind adapts to the world.
Yes, but Kant flips that completely. He suggests, what if, for us to even have knowledge of objects, the objects must conform to the structure of our minds?
Whoa. Okay, unpack that. Objects conform to our minds.
It's radical. It means our experience of the world isn't just us passively receiving information from out there. Instead, our minds are actively structuring and shaping the raw input we receive, according to their own built-in forms and rules.
So the world we experience is already shaped by our own cognitive equipment, like we're wearing inescapable mental glasses.
That's a great way to put it. The glasses are the inherent structures of our mind. We can't take them off. So the knowledge we gain isn't of things as they might be in themselves, totally independent of us, but of things as they appear to us, given the way our minds work.
That's a fundamental pivot. It changes everything about how you approach knowledge.
It really does. This Copernican turn is the absolute foundation of the critique. Everything else follows from this idea that the mind actively constitutes, in part, the world we experience.
Okay, so if our minds are doing this active structuring, what are the tools? What are the basic structures or building blocks the mind uses? This seems to take us into the first big section of the book, the Transcendental aesthetic.
Right. Kant breaks down our cognitive faculties. First, there's sensibility. That's our capacity to receive representations, basically be affected by objects. The raw material sensibility works with comes in the form of intuitions.
Intuitions. What does he mean by that exactly? Not like a gut feeling.
No, not at all in that sense. For Kant, intuitions are singular, immediate representations of individual objects. Think of the direct sensory. Hit this specific shade of red you're seeing right now, that particular sound you just heard, the feeling of pressure from your chair. It's the raw thisness given to the senses.
Okay. Direct, immediate sensory awareness of particulars.
Yes. The sources call it sensible intuition, the kind we humans have, where objects are given to us. But here's the revolutionary part of the aesthetic. Kant argues that even before we sense any particular thing, our sensibility already has a built-in structure, fundamental forms that organize any possible intuition we could have. And those forms are space and time.
Ah, yes. Space and time. This is one of Kant's most famous and maybe weirdest sounding ideas, isn't it? He says they aren't things we learn from experience, and they aren't properties of objects existing independently out there.
Correct. He argues they are a priori forms of sensible intuition. They are not concepts derived from experience. They are the necessary preconditions for having any experience at all. Space is the form of all outer sense, how we perceive things outside us, and time is the form of inner sense, how we perceive our own mental states. And because all outer intuitions also happen in time, time is the universal form of all our experience.
So they're built into our sensory system, like the grid lines on a map that allow us to place things, but the grid itself isn't part of the territory.
That's a good way to think about it. The sources really emphasize this. Space and time are a priori presentations that reside in us as forms of our sensible intuition. They are there even before an actual object has determined our sense through sensation. We can only perceive objects in space and in time because that's the fundamental way our minds are set up to receive sensory input.
So it's not that the universe is contained within space and time, but that our experience of the universe is necessarily spatial and temporal.
That's the core of it. It's about the subjective conditions of our sensibility. The sources state explicitly that time, for instance, if you abstract from our way of intuiting, is nothing. It only has objective validity, meaning it applies necessarily with regard to appearances, things considered as objects of our senses. It doesn't apply to things in themselves.
And the same for space.
Yes, the sources say space does not represent any property of things in themselves. If you take away the subjective condition of our outer intuition, the idea of space signifies nothing at all. It only applies to things insofar as they appear to us.
That really messes with your common sense view of the world. We just assume space and time are the objective container everything exists in.
It's a profound paradigm shift, absolutely central to his Copernican revolution. And this idea that space and time are subjective forms immediately leads to Kant's crucial distinction between phenomena and noumena.
Okay, let's nail that down. Phenomena are.
Phenomena are things as they appear to us. They are the objects of our actual and possible experience, already structured by the forms of our intuition, space, and time.
And noumena.
Noumena are things considered as they might be in themselves, completely independent of our minds and our ways of sensing them. The hypothetical reality behind the appearances.
And the huge implication here is...
The unavoidable implication is that we can only have genuine theoretical knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. Why? Because that's the only world that's actually given to us through our sensibility within that necessary spatiotemporal framework.
We can't know the noumena, the things in themselves.
Not theoretically, no, because they aren't presented to us through our forms of intuition. As the sources reiterate, space and time only apply to things insofar as they appear to us. Our knowledge is limited to the world structured by our own cognitive faculties.
Okay, so sensibility gives us intuitions, the raw data already filtered through the a priori forms of space and time. But that's still just raw data, right? It's not organized thought or understanding yet.
It's exactly right. As Kant famously puts it, intuitions without concepts are blind. You need something more to make sense of this spatiotemporal stream of raw sensation. And that brings us to the second key faculty, the understanding. This is the focus of the next major part, the Transcendental Analytic.
So if intuitions are singular and immediate, what are concepts for Kant?
Concepts are general representations. They are rules, basically, for unifying various intuitions under a common idea. The sources put it clearly. Through mere intuition, nothing at all is thought. Thinking happens when we relate intuitions to an object, and we do that using concepts.
Like seeing red, round, crunchy sensations and bringing them together under the concept apple.
Precisely. The concept apple is a rule that allows you to recognize this particular cluster of intuitions as an instance of a general type. Concepts allow us to categorize, judge, and understand the world, not just sense it.
And just like sensibility had its a priori forms, space and time, does understanding also have its own fundamental built-in concepts?
Yes, exactly. These are the famous categories of the understanding. They are pure concepts, meaning they don't come from experience. Instead, they are the necessary conceptual toolkit the understanding uses to structure any possible experience and make it intelligible.
What are some examples of these categories?
Kant derives a table of 12, grouped under headings like quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation, relation, substance and accident, cause and effect, community reciprocity, and modality, possibility, existence, necessity.
So concepts like substance, thinking of things as having underlying endurance or cause and effect, are actually a priori structures of our understanding, not learned from experience.
That's Kant's claim. The sources give the example. Even if you mentally strip away all the empirical properties of a body, its color, weight, hardness, you're still left with the space it occupied, which relates back to intuition, but also you can't take away the thought of it as a substance or as inhering in a substance. That necessity points to its a priori origin in our faculty of knowledge. These categories are the fundamental blueprints our minds use to organize the chaos of intuition into a world of objects and lawful connections.
So they structure our thinking about the world, our cognition.
They structure our very experience of a coherent world. They are essential for synthesizing the manifold of intuition, all those disparate sensations into unified objects and a connected reality. This leads to Kant's other famous line, "Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind."
Meaning concepts need sensory input to have anything to think about, and sensory input needs concepts to be organized into thought.
Exactly. They are completely interdependent for producing knowledge. You need both sensibility and understanding working together.
Okay, this seems to lead us to what many consider the absolute core and maybe the most notoriously difficult part of the whole critique, the transcendental deduction of the categories. What is Kant trying to deduce or prove here?
Right. This is the heavy lifting section. The question Kant faces is, okay, we have these a priori categories in our minds, like causality, substance. But why should the objects we experience necessarily conform to our mental categories? These categories aren't derived from the objects, so how can we be sure they legitimately apply to the objects? He needs to justify their objective validity for experience.
He needs to prove the mind structuring concepts actually connect properly to the world we experience.
Precisely. It's not enough to say they do apply. He has to show why they must apply for experience itself to be possible.
Yeah.
His argument is incredibly complex, famously revised between the first and second editions of the Critique. But the core idea, which the sources touch upon, centers on the conditions necessary for what he calls the synthetic unity of consciousness, or transcendental unity of apperception.
Okay, synthetic unity of apperception. Break that down.
Think about your own conscious experience right now. You have various sensations, thoughts, feelings happening. What makes it possible for you to recognize all of these diverse mental happenings as belonging to you, as part of one single unified conscious experience? The fact that I think accompanies all my representations.
The fact that it's all happening to me integrated into my awareness.
Yes. Kant argues that this unity, this ability to synthesize the diversity of intuition into a single coherent experience attributable to one, I think, is only possible if that synthesis happens according to certain rules. And those rules, he argues, are the categories of the understanding.
Ah, okay. So the categories are the necessary rules for organizing raw sensory data into a unified experience that a single consciousness can actually have.
That's the key insight. The sources say that the synthetic unity of the manifold of intuition, as generated a priori, is the very ground of the identity of apperception itself. The categories are the conditions that make unified consciousness possible. Without them operating on our intuitions, we wouldn't have recognizable objects or a coherent stream of experience, just maybe a chaotic, buzzing confusion.
So the categories must apply to the objects of our experience because they are the very rules that constitute those things as objects within a unified experience for us in the first place.
Exactly. That's the power of the deduction. The categories have a priori objective validity, as the sources state, but only for appearances, for the objects of possible experience. They apply to the phenomenal world because they are the necessary conditions under which that world can be experienced and known by unified consciousness like ours.
Wow, okay. That really establishes the power of the understanding, but also seems to clearly define its limits, which the analytic drives home.
Absolutely. The conclusion of the Transcendental Analytic is crystal clear about the boundaries of our knowledge. Having shown how knowledge requires both sensibility, intuitions in space and time, and understanding, categories, it follows that our theoretical knowledge is strictly confined to the realm of possible experience, the phenomenal world.
The concepts, the categories, can only be used on things given through our senses.
Precisely. The sources emphasize this. The pure concepts of understanding can never be of transcendental, but always only of empirical use. They have a job to do in organizing experience, but that's their only legitimate theoretical job.
Transcendental use would mean trying to use them beyond experience.
Yes, trying to apply them to things in general or things themselves, regardless of how or whether they can be given to our senses. Kant insists the principles derived from the categories like every event has a cause relate only to objects of the senses in relation to the general conditions of a possible experience. They cannot apply validly beyond that sphere.
So the understanding is powerful within its domain, but it hits a wall at the boundary of sensibility.
Exactly. The understanding, as the sources quote, can never transcend those limits of sensibility within which alone objects can be given to us. Its principles are just rules for the exposition of appearances. So that grand old ambition of traditional metaphysics, what Kant calls the proud name of an ontology, trying to get a priori knowledge of being itself, of things in general, has to be given up. It gets replaced, the sources say, by a more modest, mere analytic of pure understanding, which just analyzes how we make sense of appearances.
Which brings us right back, again, to that crucial dividing line. Phenomena versus noumena. It seems essential to keep this distinction clear.
Absolutely central. Let's recap. Phenomena are things as they appear to us, shaped and structured by our mind's inherent forms, space, time, and concepts, categories. This is the world of experience, the only world we can have theoretical knowledge of.
And noumena are things as they are in themselves, totally independent of how our minds perceive or conceive them. Hypothetical reality behind the curtain.
Right. And Kant doesn't deny the possibility of noumena. The sources note that the concept of a noumenon, taken merely problematically, is admissible but even unavoidable. It serves as a crucial concept, setting limits to sensibility.
A limiting concept, meaning it reminds us that the world of appearances might not be the whole story.
Exactly. It signifies, as the sources put it, only the thought of something in general in which I abstract from everything that belongs to the form of sensible intuition. It's the thought of something not conditioned by our way of knowing, but it's only a negative or boundary concept. It doesn't give us any positive content or knowledge about what that something might be like.
So let's be really clear. Why can't we have theoretical knowledge of these noumena, these things in themselves? It feels like a major restriction.
It follows directly from everything we've discussed about how knowledge works for us. Remember, knowledge requires both intuition, the given sensory content, and concepts, the organizing rules of the understanding.
Right. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Concepts without intuitions are empty.
Okay, now what kind of intuition do we humans have access to?
Only sensible intuition. Right. Things given through our senses, structured by space and time.
Exactly. And the categories of understanding only produce knowledge when they are applied to material provided by intuition. Since our only intuition is sensible intuition, the categories only yield knowledge when applied to appearances, to phenomena.
And noumena, by definition, are not given through sensible intuition. They're outside space and time.
Precisely. So we can't apply our categories like causality, substance, etc. to them in a way that produces knowledge. The sources state this clearly. If all sensible intuition is removed, not one of these concepts categories can in any fashion verify itself so as to show its real possibility. You can think the concept noumenon, it's logically possible, but you can't know if it corresponds to anything because you have no intuition of it.
Trying to apply our spatiotemporal concepts to non-spatiotemporal things is just a mismatch, like using a fishnet to catch wind.
Good analogy. Kant says we cannot assume that such objects noumena can be given without presupposing the possibility of another kind of intuition than the sensible, and we are by no means justified in so doing. We have no grounds to assume we possess some kind of intellectual intuition that could grasp things in themselves directly.
So the conclusion is firm. Theoretical knowledge is strictly limited to the phenomenal world.
Yes. And this has massive consequences for traditional metaphysics, which often aim precisely at knowing things like God, or the ultimate nature of the soul, conceived as non-sensible, noumenal realities. Kant says theoretical reason simply cannot go there.
But human reason doesn't just stop asking those questions, does it? It seems naturally drawn to push beyond the limits of experience.
Exactly. And that's where Kant takes us in the next major section, that transcendental dialectic. This is his analysis of how pure reason, when it forgets its limits, inevitably falls into error and illusion.
So the dialectic is about reason's mistakes.
In a way, yes. But it's not just careless mistakes. Kant thinks reason has an inherent natural drive to seek completeness, to find the ultimate explanation for everything, what he calls the unconditioned.
It always wants to ask why one more time until it gets to a final answer that doesn't depend on anything else.
Precisely. It wants the unconditioned ground. The sources explain this drive seeks unity in different areas. The unconditioned unity of the thinking subject, leading to metaphysical ideas about the soul, the unconditioned unity of the series of appearances, leading to ideas about the world as a whole, and the unconditioned unity of the conditions for all thought, leading to the idea of God as the ultimate ground.
And the problem arises when reason tries to treat these ideas of the unconditioned soul, world, God, as if they were actual objects we could know.
Exactly. Reason takes the categories which are only validly applied within experience to organize phenomena and illegitimately tries to apply them beyond experience to these transcendent ideas. It tries to use the tools for understanding the conditioned world to grasp the unconditioned.
And this leads to illusions.
Yes, what Kant calls transcendental illusion. Reason generates seemingly profound metaphysical arguments about the nature of the soul. Is it simple, immortal? The world, is it finite or infinite? Does it have a beginning? And God, does a necessary being exist? But these arguments are ultimately groundless because they misuse the concepts of the understanding outside their proper sphere.
And one of the clearest demonstrations of this misuse is what Kant calls the antinomies of pure reason.
Oh, the antinomies are brilliant. They show reason literally arguing against itself when it tries to grasp the world as a completed totality beyond experience. An antinomy is a pair of contradictory propositions, where reason seems capable of proving both sides convincingly.
Reason proves A, and then reason also proves not A. That's a major problem.
It certainly shows reason has gone wrong somewhere. The sources mention several. The first antinomy, thesis. The world has a beginning in time and is limited in space. Antithesis. The world has no beginning and no limits in space. It's infinite. Reason can cook up plausible arguments for both.
What about others?
The second antinomy deals with composition. Thesis. Everything composite is made of simple parts. Antithesis. There is nothing simple. Everything is composite. Again, conflicting arguments arise, especially when considering infinite divisibility in space. The third antinomy is crucial. Thesis. There is causality. according to freedom needed to explain the world. Antithesis. There is no freedom. Everything happens according to laws of nature, necessity.
The freedom versus determinism clash.
Yes, a huge one. The sources call freedom the real stumbling block because natural necessity seems required for science, but freedom seems required for morality. And the fourth antinomy, thesis. There belongs to the world, either as its part or cause, an absolutely necessary being. Antithesis. An absolutely necessary being nowhere exists.
So how does Kant solve these head-on contradictions? Does he pick a side?
No, his solution is more subtle and reinforces his whole system. He argues the conflict arises because reason is making a fundamental mistake. It's treating the world of appearances, phenomena, as if it were a thing in itself, noumena, or a completed totality that we could grasp all at once.
It's applying concepts meant for organizing experience to something that transcends experience.
Exactly. For instance, with the finite infinite world question, Kant says the world as appearance is never given to us as a completed whole. We investigate it empirically, extending our knowledge indefinitely, but we never reach an absolute limit or prove absolute infinity within experience. The concepts finite and infinite, when applied to the world as a whole, as if it were a noumenon, are being misused. The contradiction dissolves when you realize you're asking an illegitimate question about the phenomenal world.
So the antinomies are symptoms of reason overreaching its bounds.
Precisely. They serve as warning signs. The whole point of the Transcendental Dialectic, and indeed the critique as a whole, isn't really to destroy metaphysics, but to purify it, to show its proper boundaries.
So the outcome is, pure theoretical reason cannot give us knowledge about God, freedom, or the immortal soul, because these concepts refer to things beyond possible experience.
That's the critical conclusion for theoretical reason. As the sources indicate, the critique aims to curb reason's speculative pretensions and show where its theoretical use must be replaced by its sound practical use.
Practical use. So even if we can't prove God, freedom, or immortality theoretically, they don't just disappear from the picture, they come back in another way.
Exactly. This is Kant's brilliant move. While theoretical reason hits a dead end trying to know these things as objects, Kant argues they are necessary assumptions, postulates, for practical reason. That is, for our moral life to make sense.
Postulates, meaning things we have to assume are true, not because we can prove them, but because morality wouldn't work without them.
That's the idea. They aren't things we know theoretically what is, but they are necessary for guiding our actions. What ought I to do? The sources touch on this, noting that while theoretical reason can't prove or disprove God or a future life, these ideas connect with reason's interests and are the only means of reconciling reason's speculative side with its practical moral side.
Okay, so how does this work? Take freedom.
Well, morality fundamentally depends on the idea that we are responsible for our actions, that we could have done otherwise. If everything we do is just determined by prior natural causes like billiard balls hitting each other, then moral blame or praise doesn't really make sense. So, for morality to be coherent, we must postulate that we are free, that we can initiate actions based on reason, not just be pushed around by nature.
Even though we can't theoretically observe this freedom in the phenomenal world of cause and effect.
Right. It's a necessary assumption from the standpoint of practical reason when we consider ourselves as moral agents.
And what about God and immortality? How are they postulates?
Kant connects them to the idea of the highest good, the ultimate aim of morality, which he defines as the perfect harmony of virtue and happiness. In this life, we see that being virtuous doesn't guarantee happiness. Bad things happen to good people and vice versa. For the moral project to be ultimately rational and not futile, practical reason needs to postulate conditions where the highest good is possible.
It requires
postulating immortality, a future existence where we can continue to strive for perfect virtue, and God, a supremely rational and powerful being who can ensure that happiness is eventually distributed in proportion to virtue, creating a just moral order. The sources mention these as unavoidable problems for reason, tied to its moral employment.
So, by limiting what theoretical reason can know, Kant actually carves out a space for faith, but a faith grounded in the requirements of morality.
You could put it that way. It's a rational faith grounded in practical reason, not speculative proofs. It fundamentally shifts the basis for discussing God, freedom, and immortality. And this had a huge impact.
How so?
Well, later philosophers, particularly the German idealists like Fichte and Schelling, really ran with this idea. The sources mentioned they saw Kant's moral theology, this grounding of ultimate concepts and moral requirements, as a potential model for getting at final ontological grounds.
They thought maybe practical reason could give us metaphysical insights that theoretical reason couldn't.
Something like that. They connected Kant's practical postulates back to metaphysical questions, sometimes pushing beyond the limits Kant himself had set. You see echoes in concepts like Schelling's dark ground, perhaps hinting at aspects of reality accessible through routes other than pure cognition, building on Kant's own insights about reason's limits.
Stepping back for a moment, it's clear why the critique of pure reason is seen as such a monumental revolutionary work, but why the reputation for being so incredibly difficult.
Its importance is just immense. It offered this amazing synthesis of rationalism and empiricism, highlighting the mind's active role in constructing experience. It totally redefined the task of metaphysics by focusing on the conditions and limits of knowledge itself. It changed the questions philosophy asked.
But the difficulty is legendary.
Oh, absolutely. It's partly the sheer density of the arguments. They require intense concentration. It's also Kant's very precise technical vocabulary. The sources even mention the challenge of translating it into reasonably idiomatic English. And the concepts themselves, perception, categories, schematism, are highly abstract. It demands a lot from the reader. Kant himself revised key parts, like the deduction, which suggests he knew it was tough going.
And its influence, especially on German idealism, was immediate and profound.
Undeniably. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they all start from Kant. His idea that the mind actively structures reality became the bedrock for their own systems, where consciousness or spirit plays an even more central role in constituting reality. The sources note Schelling reflecting on how modern thought got tied up with the limits of its own cognitive capacity, a direct echo of Kant's critical project.
And they explicitly wrestled with his ideas on practical reason.
Yes, seeing those postulates perhaps not just as moral necessities but as clues to the ultimate nature of things, sometimes trying to bridge the gap Kant had opened between phenomena and noumena in ways Kant might not have endorsed.
But Kant's system isn't without its critics, right? What are some common challenges?
Oh, plenty. The whole concept of the unknowable thing in itself, noumenon, has always been controversial. Some ask, if it's totally unknowable, how can Kant even say it exists or that it affects us to produce sensations? Doesn't that involve applying categories like existence and causality beyond their legitimate sphere?
That seems like a fair point.
It's a classic criticism. Others question whether the categories and forms of intuition are truly universal and necessary a priori structures, or if they might be, say, products of human evolution, or even cultural frameworks that could be different. And then there are endless technical debates about the validity of specific arguments, like whether the transcendental deduction truly succeeds or involves circular reasoning.
So a work that transformed philosophy but remains a subject of intense debate.
Absolutely. Its enduring power is partly in the revolutionary answers it offered, but perhaps even more in the fundamental questions it forced philosophy to confront questions about the very nature of mind, knowledge, and reality.
Which brings us back to the listener. After this deep dive into Kant's complex world, why should someone today care about this dense 18th century German philosophy? What does the critique mean for you?
Because, honestly, the core questions Kant grappled with are still our questions, aren't they? What's the real relationship between my mind and the world out there? Are there ultimate limits to what science or reason can ever tell us? How much does the way I think inevitably shape what I perceive as reality? Can we really know if we have free will?
It forces a kind of critical self-awareness about our own cognitive processes.
Exactly. It makes you realize that understanding the world isn't just about looking outward. It's also about understanding the lens you're looking through your own mind, with its inherent structures and limitations. It touches everything from how we interpret scientific findings to how we think about moral responsibility and the biggest questions of meaning.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here. We journeyed through Kant's incredible architecture of the mind, starting with his Copernican revolution in response to Hume, shifting focus to the mind's active role. We explored the transcendental aesthetic space and time as a priori forms of our intuition, giving rise to the phenomena-noumena distinction.
Then the Transcendental Analytic, with the categories of understanding organizing those intuitions, justified by the complex transcendental deduction, but ultimately showing knowledge is limited to appearances.
Right, and then the Transcendental Dialectic exposed how reason falls into illusion, generating the antinomies when it tries to reach beyond experience to grasp the unconditioned, the soul, the world, God.
Showing the limits of theoretical reason's reach into metaphysics.
But then we saw how those very ideas God, freedom, immortality find a crucial, necessary place not as objects of knowledge, but as postulates of practical reason, essential for morality to make sense.
It's an incredibly intricate and profound system. This deep dive really only scratches the surface, but hopefully it conveys the sheer scale and revolutionary nature of Kant's project in the Critique of Pure Reason. It truly did reshape Western philosophy.
And it leaves us, perhaps, with a final, quite provocative thought to chew on. If Kant is right, if our theoretical knowledge is fundamentally confined to the world as it appears to us, shaped by the very structure of our minds, does that mean the ultimate nature of reality, the thing in itself, is just forever locked away beyond our grasp?
Or are there maybe other ways to relate to reality? Other forms of insight or connection perhaps hinted at by the demands of morality, as Kant suggested with his practical postulates, or maybe through art or feeling or other dimensions of experience that those later philosophers, building on Kant's own awareness of reason's limits, tried to explore. Does the story of our connection to reality end where theoretical knowledge hits its limit?